Good morning, everyone. Great pleasure for me to introduce my fellow director, Deputy Director QuakeCoRE, David Johnston. And as many of you will know, of course, we're 3 days away from the 10-year anniversary, so it's very timely that David's decided to give this talk, and I'm sure that there's a lot of important reflections, and David's going to give us some of those from his perspective, but hopefully many of you throughout the community will have a chance to convey your own expert thoughts to various members of the public as well. So we look forward to hearing some thought-provoking ideas from you, David. I'll pass over to you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you everyone for joining. What I thought I would do is really just preface this with saying this is really just some reflections over the last 10 years. In fact, I'm going to go back beyond 10 years. Really around some of the learnings from the Canterbury earthquake from my perspective. So this is not to take from the wider learnings, the institutional efforts and the work from many of you who are on this call and our other colleagues. I'm just trying to get my screen to do its thing. So actually really want to go back a bit further, and this was a photo that I took in Ridgeway School in Wellington during one of the very first shakeout drills. So from about the late 2000s, we started adopting shakeout, and this was premised on preparing for an earthquake, and we'll see what came later. And this was a bunch of, they were mainly 7-year-olds, and in amongst that is my son, so I'll premise that. And one of the questions I asked the children after they'd done the drill, had any of them experienced an earthquake? And actually not one of those children said they had experienced other than a minor earthquake. So it really got us thinking, and some of the work that I've done, I see John McClure's on this call, because much of our work was done prior to the Canterbury earthquake. So we had been working in the earthquake resilience space prior to 2010. And quite a bit of work had been done by many looking at how we both understand the earthquake risk, but also how we communicate it. So in reflecting about the lessons from the Canterbury earthquake, if you had been involved in earthquake research prior to that, it's worth thinking about what did we think about prior to the event, because the 2010-2011 earthquake sequence was such a game changer for many, but also us involved. And prior to that, in conversations with people around the country, there was some level of awareness or understanding of earthquake risk, but in many places, it was minimal, or there was a lot of misunderstanding. So we had done a number of studies, and we understand this. So we have empirical data about how people saw earthquake risk prior to 2010 around the country. And subsequently, we've done a lot of work over the last 10 years. So our knowledge of earthquakes was at a point on the 4th of September, 2010. So we're just over 10 years since that, and there was some reflections last year around that. But for many people in Canterbury, and we've got some work that Julia Becker did, she had done her PhD looking at how residents of a number of cities, including Christchurch, saw earthquake risk. And many of them really didn't think this was something that would happen. So they acknowledged earthquake risk. There was a reasonable understanding that the Alpine fault could deliver a shaking to Canterbury. But what was to unfold over the next year or plus really wasn't in the consciousness of many of the people we interacted with, both from a technical point of view, but also from sort of the public awareness and understanding of the risk. So in the early morning of September, 4th of September 2010, the Darfield earthquake really woke up physically a lot of people, but also metaphorically woke up the nation in a new way to some of the things we would experience. And it is interesting to reflect if you were involved in it, and in fact, if anyone who experienced that Darfield earthquake, really the time between then and the 22nd of February. And in some ways, we often talk about the tale of two earthquakes. So there was a period of time between September and February of 2011 when a number of things happened. I'll just go back to the, go back to the damage. So although there was significant damage to Christchurch, Canterbury Region from 2010 September, many people really and probably couldn't appreciate what was to come, and we as researchers, scientists also were not necessarily expecting that, although there had been talk about it. This image here, which many of you have seen, is the moments after the earthquake that struck on the 22nd February. Much of the plumes that you see there is the dust from building collapse and largely unreinforced masonry. So this image was captured within seconds or so of the earthquake and the destruction that had caused. So as we come up to 10 years since this moment, and this was the event that caused the major loss of life and really changed both the response we had to that followed, but also the way we saw earthquake risks. The earthquake sequence, as many of you know, but there are obviously people who are new to this, continued on for a long time, and in some ways is still continuing. So there were two more significant magnitude 6+ earthquake in the June and December of 2011, but the pattern of earthquakes across Christchurch, across the Canterbury region, continued for a long time. People often ask why it was so damaging. Why was this lesser magnitude earthquake so damaging compared to the earlier 7.1? And to me, this cartoon here, this cross-section of Christchurch, really is the easiest illustration that I've found, both to explain why that event was so damaging, so deadly. And if you were to design a geological structure to cause the most harm, you probably couldn't do it better than this. So we had the release of an old fault under the city, directing its energy straight at Christchurch. And if you see the layers of Christchurch built on, in many parts, soft sediments. So the structural orientation of this rupture really was what was so deadly to it. And we see here some of the images, the really graphic and tragic images of some of the consequences of that event coming up to 10 years ago. So after that event, many people were involved from the scientific community, but I also acknowledge the community itself in aspects of the recovery, and I'll touch on some of the key points and really reflect on some of the learnings as I go through. And there are a number of review papers about it. So there is considerable research that has followed over the last decade, and I really don't have time in this talk to acknowledge it all, but I'll just take on some issues and some points of the work that I was involved in and reflect on some of the others. So obviously the region, there was about 500,000 people in the region and about 370 in the city who were directly impacted by this event. The death toll was 185 with well over 7,000 injuries. And one of the opportunities we've had since that is really to better understand, asking how are people injured or killed in earthquakes. And I think we, from the Canterbury, one of the legacies of that is our much deeper appreciation about harm to people and also opportunities to reduce harm to people during and immediately after that earth shaking. And there's probably several talks or more than an hour or so I could talk about some of the research we did around the behavioral and building response leading to deaths and injuries, and really how to reduce that toll in the future. The damage was widespread. There were very few people in the region who didn't have some form of damage to their property. So it was widespread. So it affected and touched most people in the region directly and indirectly, a much greater number across the country because people are connected. And immediately after the earthquake, there were a large number of houses that people were displaced from. So they were not safe to stay in for any prolonged period of time. So we had massive issues with both the housing of people in the aftermath and the repair of that building stock. And there's quite a lot about that we can reflect on, both the policies, the procedures, both the technical and the social and the insurance and the financial around that rebuild. And we'll touch on that in a minute. Obviously, or in addition, there was a massive damage to the heritage buildings of the city. So the city of Christchurch, as it is now, is not like the city of the past. And that has both opportunities and challenges going forward. In terms of impacts on people and health, a number of things that had to be addressed immediately. So obviously the health system is both compromised in terms of the ability to deliver health services. The physical mechanisms for it, from hospitals to health clinics, were damaged. Individuals who work in those were, at a time of increased demand for those, so immediately afterwards, and both the physical and mental health services. So I think the Canterbury DHB and all those involved in the health response have done an amazing job, and had to in a very short time, to deal with the size of this event. This really exceeded anything that we had experienced in recent times in New Zealand in terms of sheer demand on the system, and the ongoing aftermath of it with the continued aftershock sequence. So we saw a long period of time. One area of particularly interest to some of my colleagues, and I had some involvement, was really looking at the most vulnerable members of our community and also how certain groups did. So being elderly is not necessarily vulnerable, but there are issues you have to face. So there was a massive impact on aged care facilities, and I think this story has probably not been shared as widely as it could. Many people in aged care facilities had to leave, and it had a lot of demand on and stress and, in fact, loss of life to very aged old people in that immediate aftermath as we moved people from aged care facilities that were damaged or weren't functional. The other area that has received some considerable interest and research is really around the impact on children, and particularly played out within schools in the tertiary sector. And I'll really leave it to my colleagues from Lincoln and Canterbury University to expand on in questions or at a later date the impact on them and their functioning. So I do acknowledge the colleagues from the universities who went through this, but also the schools as well. And I'll touch on some of the figures from that as well. So immediately after the earthquake, there was major disruption to a number of things. So we had, obviously, food supplies were closed, so supermarkets, and there were also many responses to that we saw. So there was no water supply for many days, and in some cases weeks, to a large proportion of the city. We had over 100,000 houses without sewage for a protracted period of time. We had 37,000 houses without power. So there was a number of things that had to be addressed. I won't go through all these numbers, that would take up most of my speaking time, but this was a slide I borrowed from a paper presented by MSD, really reflecting on it. And I think the second set of numbers also really shows the magnitude and scale of the response to it. So despite the fact that well over 370,000 people were impacted severely, the actual numbers in welfare centres in the first few days was only a few thousand. So the majority of residents actually sheltered in place or moved out or sheltered with others in the city or somewhere beyond. So this often is a common concern about looking after the immediate well-being of people, but the majority of people actually sorted their own arrangements out. But 2,500 or 2,700 is still a large number of people who needed assistance. And there were a number of other issues that the Ministry of Social Development and NGOs had to address in the immediate aftermath. One of the significant issues for much of the eastern suburbs really was water and sewage and electricity, but the water and sewage problem persisted for a long time. So things like finding 40,000 chemical toilets, and the mechanics of and the sort of logistics of dealing with this was a challenge. There were well over 1,000 visitors in the city from other countries who were moved out of the city immediately. So definitely in other parts, so in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Wellington, had a major operation to move out well over 1,000 people. Many of these people were out in the streets at the moment. Their passports were in their hotel rooms to which they didn't have access. So there are a number of significant challenges in the immediate aftermath of it. And really just acknowledging the amazing efforts from those agencies in response. One of the challenges in disaster response is preparing for very rare events. So you don't have much time to practice that, practice many of these issues. And many of the things people dealt with really the actual plans had to be developed sort of on the hoof to meet the needs, because that's the nature of it. So people know the general areas to which they have to respond to, but the detailed planning really happened at the moment as we dealt with what happened. In the longer term, there are a number of social things that really had to be managed and understood and planned for that really hadn't. So what we see globally in disasters is that crime often decreases, and this actually pattern emerged in the immediate aftermath. Despite the fact that properties, their security systems were damaged, actually crime decreased in the months to years after the event. People helped each other in ways that they hadn't. However, during times of stress, people do respond in different ways, and we did see an immediate and sustained increase in issues of domestic and family violence, which is often a negative side to disasters, brought about by the acute situation. Housing affordability and availability was a major problem and persisted and still persists, both in Christchurch, but actually it's a national problem. It's really around that combination of availability and affordability. What happened when people's houses were damaged? Insurance companies would pay for them to relocate whilst they were getting repairs. That immediately increased demand for rental properties, which increasing demand in an open economy increases rents. Many people were displaced not because their rental property was uninhabitable, but because rents often in case doubled, displacing because others could fill them from insurance money. So you had a domino effect where the person in the rental property moved to a cheaper rental property, the person in the less desirable one whose rent had moved to a caravan, and the person in the caravan often moved out onto the streets. Rentals for caravans doubled in price as well. So you had a domino effect, which unfortunately pushes those at the far end off into less than desirable accommodation needs. Even if the demand, the demand was there, but the impact on people meant that a number of people whose accommodation was undamaged were still forced to relocate due to market forces. And I think that's one of the learnings that came out of this, really about the intervention in that immediate aftermath to address some of these issues. Much work has been done, and I've just referenced some of Douglas Payton's work, but there's quite a lot of work really looking at how the community responded to the earthquake, and really positive as well as negative consequences of this. Obviously, one of the key predictors on how people responded was the ability to access or be part of community networks. What we saw is many emergent groups appeared. Here's the Student Volunteer Army as one example, but there were many more of these beyond the Volunteer Army. Many community groups that had a non-disaster purpose repurposed their needs. So bowling clubs and bridge clubs became groups for doing other social services to support their communities. And then the emergent new groups that hadn't existed before. So we saw a mobilization of the community in many interconnected and complex ways. One of the key predictors about the success of that really came to leadership. So we saw the emergence of a number of leaders in the community at different levels, existing leaders stepping up, and the emergence of new people and new groups showing leadership in particular areas to meet the needs of the community. And we really saw how participation and connection to those groups was really critical to the successful response and recovery of it. And there's much research sort of pinning to that. One of the questions that we had as researchers really was, how do we monitor what's going on? Because in a 21st century media world, there is much out there and people can tell you how they're feeling, and the social media is full of voices. And it is often very difficult to always make sense of what's happening and for all voices to be heard. So there was a deliberate attempt to try and sort of gauge how things were going over time. And I just want to acknowledge the work of, it was Sarah at the time, MSD was part of this, and now being being picked up by the Canterbury District Health Board to really put in place some measures about how people were doing over time. So Canterbury earthquakes, and one of the reflections of the last 10 years is that it is a very data-rich earthquake recovery. We know a lot about a lot of things, which hopefully we can then lead to improve the way we deal with the next one. But quality of life as a measure, and there are measures of this, but the Sarah Wellbeing Survey, which was then renamed the Canterbury Wellbeing Survey, is a longitudinal cross-sectional survey that has been running since 2012, almost 8 years now, where every 6 months, initially for the first 6 years and now every year, has captured some key markers of how well people are doing as a way to really learn the impact or to understand how the recovery is going. So even after about a year after the earthquake, the majority of residents said that their quality of life was reasonably good, was good or extremely good. Now, 74% is a good number, but that means that about a quarter of people are actually not doing that well. In this case, there were 7% who said it was extremely poor. And when you've got a large population, a few percent of a large number is still a large number. So there were significant portions of the community who were not and have not done well in the earthquake. And part of us as researchers is to really understand who they are, why it is the way it is, and what can we do in the future to make things better for all of our citizens. But the good positive of this is that actually the majority of people in Canterbury and Christchurch did okay. They were obviously not happy with what happened. It did not mean that they weren't empathetic to the others, didn't mean they didn't suffer loss or sorrow or sadness, but their quality of life was okay, that they were able to function. And in this case, 74% of people a year after said it was good. And that partly reflects many of the policies brought in place. It also reflects the distribution of impacts and the measures put in place to address those impacts. So governments obviously are looking after or hope to look after the well-being of their people, and we had some measures in place. What we have seen by this survey 8 years on is that many of the very difficult or the highly impacted people, their quality of life has not got better. There's still a significant proportion of people who are not doing well. And although it's under 10%, that's still a large number of people who have been affected. And in terms of stress, we were interested in, much has been spoken about the mental health and psychosocial recovery of folk after the earthquake. And once again, we were looking at measures to put into place to both deal with some of the stresses that people face, but also measure them over time. And really, this is really probably not a very good measure over time, is that still a year or so after the earthquake, 23% of the population sort of had experiencing negative effects in their life, and really these numbers have been stubbornly high. So there are significant issues affecting the recovery of a good proportion of the Canterbury residents, even if the majority of people are having reporting good quality of life. There are still issues to be addressed. And I think, as many of you know, and if, oh, sorry, I'm jumping the wrong way. As many as you know, and the Royal Commission of Inquiry has pointed this out into EQC, much of the issues is around damage to buildings and people's ability to deal with insurance claims. So I would like to suggest, and I think the evidence is strong, we still have a long way to go to really resolve many of the issues in the post-disaster context, from dealing with unresolved issues, and the majority of those relate to insurance claims. So although this is not a simple answer, and there are many commentators who think there are some simple fixes, but I think the insurance and the recovery processes for those dealing with that do need to be looked at, and that was clearly, there are sets of recommendations in the Royal Commission into this that hopefully will address or help understand what is needed to improve this. So 8 years after the earthquake, 10% of people still reporting unresolved issues with insurance is problematic, and many commentators have sort of spoke to that. So really just reflecting, and maybe this will lead to sort of the discussion that we have, and I'm happy to answer some questions, is really we still have a challenge both as researchers but also communities themselves to how do we prepare for disasters, and what can we learn from that experience of the last 10 years. So many of us in the next have for the last 10 years, but in the next few months, at least in the next few weeks, we'll be reflecting on much of our knowledge, both in terms of what we've learned, but maybe what we haven't learned, and really how to take this research into practice. Are there things that make communities more resilient? Have we got the right policies, practices in place? Do we have the right information and understanding to find those? And will we be able to respond to future disasters? So really, in reflection, to learn from the past. And one of the challenges around resilience, if that term is used, and we will use it for now, is really what is resilience and how do we build it? And there are obviously two approaches. If you take it in a general sense, there's obviously things that institutions, the state, can do from the top down. So the framework that we create that puts in place during or before and during a disaster, and really from the bottom up, how do communities resource themselves, organize themselves to become resilient? So subsequent to the Canterbury earthquakes in 2010, New Zealand was part of a global initiative to set a national framework for disaster response, the Sendai framework, and that manifests now within the National Disaster Resilience Strategy that came out a couple of years later. So we really have all of our experiences from the Canterbury earthquake to feed into building from a top down the right arrangements for preparing for and responding to disasters. But much of our research, if you look at it both in pre-disaster periods and from the Canterbury experience, really points to that resilience and recovery is largely in the community. It's community-based. It's about how individuals, communities, whānau, organize themselves and respond and help themselves, because there is a degree to which the state will never meet the needs in the immediate acute phase of a disaster. And we really need to understand how communities themselves are empowered to prepare for and respond to disasters. So I think one of the challenges we saw in the Canterbury experience was often the clash between the bottom down and top up approach, and really how you reconcile that before and during sort of an earthquake. And I think some of the work needed to be done is really understanding not necessarily what makes resilience, but how you mobilize the inherent resources that are available at all levels. So I'm just going to end with this image, because this is, I think, one of the legacies I'd like to see from the Canterbury earthquake, and our understanding of that event is, how do we prepare for the future? What are the lessons we have learned as a nation? What are the issues that we still haven't addressed and we need to address going forward? But if we want to lie awake at night wondering what could get us next, this image to me really sort of says what it's all about, because sooner or later, somewhere in New Zealand, we will have a future earthquake. It may well be Christchurch or Canterbury, but there's a good chance it's somewhere else. So what are the knowledge, the legacies that we can learn as researchers, as QuakeCoRE, as academics, but also members of the community? Because the people of Canterbury at all levels have experienced an event and have come through it over a period of time. So really want to reflect on the last decade, what we've learned, what we haven't learned, and maybe what we can share to those outside the region as part of that legacy of the experience, but also to be mindful and respectful and empathetic to the difficult journey for those in Canterbury have been through in the last decade, and really acknowledge the efforts of all who've been involved in helping respond to and recover from what was a very traumatic event. So thank you, and very open to questions. I'll stop sharing my both questions or any comments from anyone listening. So.
Thanks so much, David. Brendan has unfortunately needed to head off early, so he's asked me to coordinate the questions. So on behalf of us all, thank you so much for an excellent talk, as always, and love to invite the group assembled here to pose any questions. John.
Am I unmuted? Can you hear me?
You are.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks for the talk, David. That was great, and very succinct. Just one of your graphs was really interesting, how the numbers feeling extremely poor dropped really sharply in 2019 from 4% or 5% to 2%. And the numbers who said they're feeling good jumped too, from 81 to 86. So I was interested, was there anything in that year that really affected people? I wondered if it was something to do with the insurance, the government saying that all insurance cases must be dealt with. But it's interesting that the number feeling really poor dropped in half over that year from 2018 to 2019. But I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
I think some Canterbury residents might have some lived experience with that. I think there was obviously the Royal Commission of Inquiry, who basically stood back and said, tell us what the problems are. So there was a change of government and an openness to listen. There was also additional resources put in to help facilitate more speedy claim settlement. But maybe, Tom, you're down there, you might, that's my understanding.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't feel like I can wade in on that, but it was complex. It's probably the way to put it. Any other questions?
Yeah, Jordan, you had one in the comment box. Do you want to ask us?
Oh, sorry, I'm missing the comment.
That's right. No, that's the easiest way to get your attention. Have you made a comparison of the New Zealand experience versus the USGS shakeout scenario, which was based on their lived experience over the many years of major events they'd had? Did you find a great deal of comparisons, or has that's more used with the engineering world?
I think I've been involved in some of the US policies and practice, so they've been obviously looking at lessons from us, but I think there's probably a piece of work to do some systematic comparison between some of their responses and their lessons. Both nations have been through earthquakes. I think we've had more recent lived experience in New Zealand, and we tend to build off each other's knowledge. So there is strong partnership with the US. Obviously, the last year or so has made that interaction a bit more difficult, we tend to like to hop on a plane, but that's something from the past. But I think that there's probably more opportunity to build on the knowledge that comes out from the US. If the US earthquake risk in many areas is similar to New Zealand, but their collective effort, obviously, with their population and investments, is probably 100 times the value of ours from a research perspective. So I think that there's benefits from a small nation working with other global colleagues, but equally there's much global interest in the lessons from New Zealand. So we are part of a global village, and I think we don't have all the answers, and I think some of our answers need to come from both our own experience, our own research, but also we can still always learn from others. And I think we need to globalize our knowledge and share it and build from others' experience and lessons as well. Not sure I answered your question, but.
No, that's fine. I'm in Australia, and it's been 30 years and I can't remember how many months. No, 31 years now, and we have no fear still, which ours was on a public holiday when no one was at work, so, and the kids were not at school. So where we have an estimated 300 to 500 people would have been lost, we don't have any fear because it's a blip on what would have been a major event. So I find it, like Sarah McBride's research into the communications and having people take things seriously, it's very hard to get to break through when people don't see it. And so New Zealand has learned, and you acknowledge that in everything there.
Well, I would ask that question, have we learned? I think our experience is quite regional. I think those in Canterbury, those in Wellington, have a much higher earthquake risk literacy than other parts of the country. And the lack of a lived experience in other parts of the country is probably one of the determinants on how prepared people are, not the absolute level of risk they face. So I am fearful for other parts in New Zealand. The next urban earthquake may well be in somewhere else that hasn't had a recent earthquake, and we may be surprised, as the members or the people in Australia were when the Newcastle earthquake struck. So a small magnitude earthquake in Auckland could do a lot of damage, and people, we predict, and our research shows, they will say, well, we didn't expect that. So I think that there are challenges are still there for New Zealand, as well as many other countries.
Yes, indeed. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions for David? Okay, well, shall I ask something slightly provocative? So David, I mean, like many on this call, I lived through the Canterbury earthquake sequence and the recovery since, and have been involved in aspects of research around it. And New Zealand's taken a big push towards trying to have much more sort of co-productive type research partnerships with policy and practice decision makers, and trying to get that research into practice. But I think it would be fair to say, or at least for me personally, but I suspect the community, the research community, still is at times frustrated at the lack of pickup of research findings and using evidence within policy and so on. Where do you see that going forward? How can we continue to break through those challenges? You alluded to a lot of them during your talk. And what would be the aspiration for the next, in 10 years' time? Where would we want to be?
Sure, I think there's a couple of points there. So one is, I agree with you, very frustrating at times. I think we need to put ourselves in that policy practice environment more. And I think that sometimes that's not necessarily about going to everything, but being more aware of it. We also need to bring some others into our research world. And I think the last decade, if I would say anything, we've made great steps in doing that. But let's take what is a start as only a start, and we need to do more. Acknowledge that. It is very difficult to imagine extreme events that you have no context because you've got no lived experience when there are immediate stresses happening at the moment. We're seeing that play out, and I'll touch in areas that not mine, but you take building, houses, land use planning. There is an urgent and rightfully urgent need to provide housing for our citizens. but we're also trying to choose good places to put that housing, and often those pressures, those immediate pressures, will force probably less awareness or effort given to more long occurring events, the more infrequent events. So I think it's still too simple to say, why do planners put houses in bad places, when in fact they have every day driving around the streets, and if you see people living in backyards and caravans and tents, you can see why they do it, because they want to house our citizens. So often we seem to think these arguments are binary, they're either or, but in fact, we got to be much more nuanced. And how do we help achieve non-earthquake issues, address those, but making sure our earthquake resilient knowledge is infused in it. But it sometimes means that we need to be empathetic to the other problems that they face and maybe work together. And often the solution is a hybrid of the two extremes, and then you can create some new win-win opportunities. So I think we need to be more innovative about how we address earthquake resilience building, especially in areas that are not, it's easy to convince people in Canterbury about the need for it, but you try and do it in Northland or Auckland and you've got a bit more of a challenge.
Wonderful, thank you. Nirmal, did I see you flash up with a question, or was I just imagining something there?
No, you were right. I thought that was the last question. Thanks, David, for that question. One question I had is on the insurance. Are we better prepared insurance-wise for a future scenario? Once again, provocative, but what are your thoughts? And is there any way to influence policy or government thing to have better insurance claim for future events?
Well, I probably can't answer the immediate question, are we better now? But I will acknowledge that the issues raised in the Royal Commission of Inquiry to EQC, which really was not just about EQC, it was about the insurance framework, have a very good set of recommendations. And there are some very smart people in various places really proactively and with good purpose trying to address those issues raised in that report. So I think because we've documented the lived experience of things not working, we are better prepared with that knowledge than we would if we didn't have it. Have we brought about changes? I think that's still work in progress, but you would always say that with every policy or practice in every area, we could always do better. But I think we've at least acknowledged that the previous system had many flaws. We have owned it at the highest political level, hence the Royal Commission and the government accepting. It is work in progress to find solutions, but solutions to complex problems don't come tomorrow. And some of them are still difficult as we are facing, set in the context of another disaster, a COVID global pandemic that really is both giving opportunities for enhancing earthquake resilience, but also significantly reducing the ability for councils to address some of the things they would like to do. So there are both positives and negatives during another unrelated disaster for achieving what we're trying to do. And it's really trying to find that balance. But I think we just need to keep asking these questions. It sounds like a politician's answer.
Okay, any final questions, or have we reached the end of them?
Yeah, I've got one, Tom.
Great, Mark.
Yeah, David, just a bottom line question. Would you say that Christchurch is now, for the longer term, all things considered, the most earthquake resilient city in New Zealand because of the rebuild and because of all the aspects regarding, you know, human psychology, preparedness, all that sort of thing that has happened from this earthquake sequence? Because that's something I hear banded around, and certainly when you drive around Christchurch and stuff, you don't see the frail, unreinforced masonry city. You see something that's more like a modern, boomtown American city sort of thing with high building standards and things. So You know, another event like this, do you think it would be better off than, you know, comparable places that had not experienced such an earthquake sequence?
Sure. I mean, it is true to say that the city has been seismically cleansed. So clearly removing vulnerable buildings, whether they are taken down before an earthquake or taken down by the earthquake, does remove them. They're not there anymore. So obviously you reduce the vulnerability to those buildings. In terms of people and experience, I think we often have two things happening in parallel, and we see this with other disasters. You can simultaneously improve and increase and decrease your preparedness for future events. So those who had negative consequences are more likely to be prepared for the future or be aware of or take actions. Often when bad things happen and you aren't impacted for whatever reason, it can actually reduce your perceived need to do more in the future. So complacency can come in, or the situation, because of luck, you were not impacted negatively because you happened to be in point A instead of point B. You often can attribute that to perceived need to do anything more in the future. So I would say at times, and if you take the time between the Canterbury earthquakes and the QuakeCoRE earthquake affecting Wellington, it actually, in some ways, improved the perceived need, whether you did it or not in Wellington. But in other quarters, it actually reduced our national preparedness for future events. People seem to say, well, we had that event, they got it, it's okay. They've heard the government message, they've seen the Sarah ad about the rebuild, all is well, so why do we have to worry? So there is that, and John McClure might comment, but there is a psychology where sometimes good fortune or bad fortune can play out both ways. So fatalism, it's so bad, there was no point bothering. I prepared for an earthquake. We had an earthquake and it was really bad, so why did I bother preparing? It was still going to be bad, so therefore I won't bother in the future. So these things can come simultaneously, and often in the same individual. We might be much prepared in one part of our preparedness journey and less in another. We become complacent. I wasn't prepared for the earthquake and I got through okay, so why bother preparing? Because I know I can do it again next time.
Right.
We often discount the attribution from other things that made things worse or better. So the answer is, I think we are we are both increase and decrease our preparedness for the future.
Yeah, up and down. Yeah, useful.
In
Thanks.
strange and interesting ways.
Yeah. That's a useful answer. Thanks.
John McClure.
Well, just if no one else has got a question, so after the earthquakes, there seemed to be, in terms of the rebuild, there seemed to be a real tension that the community came up with plans, and they were asked for plans and put these ideas all over boards around the cathedral and so on. And then the government, or Sarah, had a different plan, and it was sort of superimposed over the community plans. And I just wondered if we've learned anything from that, that sort of tension. And I wonder if that demoralised the community in Christchurch a bit, that they were asked for their ideas and then their ideas seem to be brushed aside. So I don't know if David has a thought on that, or you, Tom, because you were there.
Well, I could let Tom answer. I'll speak from a point of view as a political scientist, but Tom can go first.
Oh no, it'd be easy to follow you, I think.
Sure. So, I mean, this is in recovery. If you look globally at recovery, there is often this contest between rapidly addressing things immediately, both for practical, political, perceived economic reasons. We must get up and running quickly, versus a more deliberative approach, building back to address some of the things that weren't right. And these tensions play out at all levels, at communities right through to politics. I would speculate that we may have had a different approach under the current government versus the previous government. So often these are ideologically driven, where depending on in a democratic process, whoever's in power is going to have a different lens on it. So in some ways you could argue that, well, they're not right or wrong, they're just different ideological approaches that different parties choose, but they are voted by the people, so you get what you ask for to some degree. And you therefore change happens as well by the people. So we've obviously had, and that's both the strengths and the weaknesses of participatory democracy we live in. Tom.
I agree with everything you've said, and I feel awkward, trying to convey as from a Christchurch resident's perspective, because there's so many on the call that have probably studied this and thought about it more than me. But I guess my perception was that in the early days of 2011, immediately after the earthquake, was that there was a real buzz around the city to feed into a bright shared future. And then when, for lack of a better way to describe it, when things got hard, but also when there was clear dysfunction from the Christchurch City Council and clear dysfunction to the Crown or central government agencies and central government actors, and it got tricky and bogged down. That, in some ways, for me, as someone that wasn't as affected as many others, physically or necessarily emotionally, that really killed off a lot of the morale or collapsed a lot of morale. And so whilst the effort of trying to have this wonderful participatory approach, in some ways it made us, it was even more hurtful when it sort of collapsed and fell down. So I think there's definitely a strong lesson around that. And I mean, others who have studied that, I'm sure, well, I've read, have articulated that much more accurately and succinctly than I have.
Tom, can I make a comment there?
Of course, yeah.
I visited Kobe a few years ago and talked to the people involved with the earthquake and the recovery there, probably 20 years ago now. And the story they told, whether or not it's strictly correct, I'm not in a position to tell. But they said that in the initial response to that event, the Japanese government were starting to be very, very heavy-handed. As a result of which the local government, with the support of the citizens, pushed back very, very hard. And in the end, the recovery in Kobe was very substantially locally led rather than national government driven. And it seemed to go very well from what we can tell. Just a comment.
Thanks, Tim.
Yep, thank you all for that answer.
Okay, I'm conscious that we're just coming towards the end of the allotted time. Perhaps could I suggest if anyone's got any additional questions or comments they'd like to share with David, they contact him directly by email, or no doubt DJ will swing into an area that you're close to soon and you can talk face to face. But thank you all for the wonderful turnout. And on behalf of QuakeCoRE, thanks very much, David, and all the very best for the next couple of days, which will be significant for all of us. Thanks very much.
And thank you all for listening.
Thank you.